Hello and welcome to the latest episode of How Do You Manage by Not the Top 20. And listener, you'll be surprised to know that I'm very excited and delighted to be joined by Oxford United's manager, Gary Rowett, on this special episode. Gary, how are we?
I'm all good, George. Yeah, I'm up for a slightly more relaxing few days after the last 3 or 4 weeks or 3 or 4 months. Yeah, pleased we managed to get it over the line. Yeah, look, we still want to win the last game, but I think ultimately we've earned the right to be a little bit more relaxed.
Yeah, absolutely. Safety secured on the penultimate match of the season, beating Sunderland 2-0 at home. But Gary, for you, I think normally we expect players and staff and everyone to have a bit of a celebration off the back of achieving what was set out to be done, but none of that for you, was there?
No, it wasn't quite a usual celebration for me. It was straight off. I don't even notice, but when everyone else was going onto the pitch and waving and applauding the fans, I was trying to save my legs for the next day. So I went straight back into a dressing room, partly because I felt like I needed to lie down anyway. But yeah, because I had the marathon. I had the marathon the next day. Again, it's something that I think I've used quite well to distract me from football at times. I feel sometimes you have to have a little bit of something outside, something where maybe you can achieve something different, and that's how I've always been. So yeah, it's a nice distraction. It's a little bit of a sort of passionate pursuit of mine, I really enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy the 20 degrees heat, but I certainly enjoyed the event. What I didn't enjoy was the Player of the Year awards afterwards, where I had to cram my feet into some smart shoes for 5 hours. That wasn't in the plan. So yeah, that was quite painful.
What was your time in the marathon?
38. So yeah, I don't know if anyone saw it, but out of all the ex-footballers, there was a lot younger ones than me. I think only Millsy beat my time, I think. So yeah, I was quite pleased with the PB. But I've done quite a few now. I've done five Londons, or that was my fifth London.
Wow.
And I've done quite a few others. So yeah, my quickest time so far. I'm getting quicker as I get older.
I'll join you next time because I need to get fit. Me and Ali did a charity run from Bramall Lane to Hillsborough with Phil Jagielka a couple of weeks ago, which we trained for, and then we ended up walking most of it anyway. So I think doing the marathon with you, it seemed like a better.
Disgraceful.
So let's talk about the season. You took over Oxford back in December at a time where the newly promoted side had only won one of their previous 16 league games. And now, 52 points with a game still to spare, safety secured. Where does this rank in your achievements in your managerial career up to this point?
Yeah, I think pretty high. If I look at the sort of tools and if I look at where the squad was, again, coming in off the back of, it's always going to be a little bit difficult. Someone so popular as Des and who obviously got the team promoted last season and started the season so well. But I think coming into that, you can only sort of judge it on where you were, which was, I think the team had won 1 in 16 or something like that. And I think actually to have, certainly the start to have gone on, but I think won 5 and drew 4 out of the first 9 games was a sort of start beyond even my sort of wildest imagination. And I think that gave me certainly a lot of hope. We had, of course we had a few bumps in the road along the way. But yeah, I would say that has to be right up there. I mean, if I look at some of the, sort of playoff campaigns, apart from sort of Burton, the Derby one was with a good squad. Birmingham was a good squad, although I felt we achieved good things there. Millwall to get in the top 10 sort of virtually 4 years running again was a good achievement. But yeah, I think this has to be right up there in terms of what we've achieved. Again, I'm not one for personal sort of accolades necessarily. I'm not one to shout from the rooftops about achieving safety. I think it's a hard one. It doesn't sit right with me to say this is an amazing achievement staying up. It feels like an unambitious view on things, but I suppose looking at where the team were, looking at the size of the club, looking at the fact they hadn't been in the Championship for many, many years, I suppose it has to be viewed as a really important moment for the club to be able to stabilise. So therefore, feels like a big achievement.
What are the challenges that come with taking over a club midway through the season? Because you did it with success at Millwall. You went into Birmingham last season at a time where things were pretty perilous. And even though Birmingham ended up going down, the actual results that you achieved in your points per game were still good enough that over the course of a long period of time would have kept Birmingham safe. And then, of course, you've come into Oxford and delivered this great job over a period of 5 months or so. So what are the challenges that comes with coming into a club, probably at a low ebb, given that they're managerless? And why do you think you're so capable at turning results around?
Yeah, I think if you look at coming into a club around that time, I suppose you have two sort of choices in some ways. You're either a head coach manager who's wed to a system and you're going to try and deliver and coach that system because you're familiar with that, regardless of the players and regardless of where they're at. Or, you're the sort of head. I'm not saying you can't be both, or you're a manager that comes in and you try to look at the capabilities of the players. You look at the division, you look at your experiences, and you're trying to find a way to get the very best out of those individuals within a system, I think, that suits. And I think that's what I've always tried to do. I've always been, I think, quite good at sensing what the right plan for the right team at the right moment is. And I suppose that's where I've sort of managed to get good results at lots of different clubs and different teams. I'd probably view Stoke as the only one that didn't happen, but even then, we'd lost very few games in the last period, and the pressure was different. But that's always my mindset. I think I'm not in any way, shape, or form, comparing myself, but I think Carlo Ancelotti always says, I pick the system around the best players and the qualities of the players, and I think that is my mindset as well. I think I'm always quite flexible in that. So yeah. Look, obviously the experience of this division over a number of years, but that's what I try to do. So, again, straight away we're playing players in different positions than the previous manager because that's where we feel the strengths and hopefully, well, I think it's proven that we managed to get some good results and the best out of some of those players.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And when you look at, I guess, the efficiency maybe of the results you achieved at Oxford with the defensive record improving and a real efficiency from set pieces, and in particular the trebuchet that is the Will Vaulks long throw. I mean, how calculated was the set piece side of things? Because clearly it's been a massive tool to be used by you in the last 6 months or so. And do you think often, it may not be the flashiest or it may not be that attractive or whatever else, but do you think the use of set pieces and how effective they can be from both an attacking and defensive standpoint is often overlooked?
Yeah, and also you have to make a judgment call when you come in. I think, if you look at the team before, that the team were, from people that told me trying to play an expansive style of football, but the reality is if that expansive style of football is not winning your games, then, your job is to win. Like, my job's never been to make myself look good or to make the style of play look attractive to others. It's basically, look, we want to win games for the fans, but we also short term needed to find a way to win those games. And if that meant being a little bit more pragmatic, we actually had a meeting with the players probably about 10 games ago, and the players were actually asking for a more pragmatic style because they felt like we just needed to get over the line. They were almost saying, look, we're at the stage of a season, we just need to go and get some results. And I think it was interesting that often you get the opposite, whereas actually that was the sort of the mindset of the players, which I think is fantastic. So I think at that point we just felt as though, look, we're going to have to utilise the throw a little bit more because it's been effective. Set pieces are look, you're always trying to score from set pieces. I don't think there's any coach in the world that doesn't try to score from set pieces because it's another armour. It just so happened we tended to score more goals from those than we were effective in open play. And look, consciously or unconsciously, we'd have loved to have scored loads of goals in open play, but the reality is our top scorer is on 6 goals. So there wasn't an easy way to play our way through teams. The stats and the data were telling us that wasn't going to be a way of staying in the division. So therefore, we had to be flexible. And I think, what we want to do short term, what we want to do long term, are very different things. But it's about winning games, isn't it? About being effective. And I think the fans have enjoyed that sort of that effort and that commitment from the players, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, if there has been a criticism from the fan base at Oxford and possibly at Millwall as well, it's been around playing style. I think that the Cardiff game in particular, where Cameron Brannigan fires in from 40 yards from a free kick, but apart from that, Oxford didn't create too much. And I always find it quite strange where there seems to be a perception that is almost by design, where I always think there's no way if you go to any manager after a poor attacking performance and say you're happy, that they're never going to say that's how I set out to do it. But what would be your kind of riposte, I guess, to those who criticise the style?
Yeah, look, again, you want to. I always say the same thing. Most managers set out, if you can play fantastic attacking front foot football, and win lots of games of football, that's the style that everyone would choose, right? If you can't do that because you haven't got a budget to do that, then playing slightly less attacking football and winning is plan B. Plan C is, you start going down the list to the point where you go, would you take attacking football but never win a game? Is that something that people would find attractive? The reality is the end result dictates often how people see things. So I think we always want to, we brought in Zian Fleming at Millwall. He scored 15 goals, and some of his goals were incredible, yet people still want to label pragmatic. Sometimes that's just a label you're never going to get away from, right? So, I think what you end up doing is focusing less on that and trying to build a team that can win games in different ways. We don't want to be a set piece and long throw team, and that's it. But I don't think we are. I think anyone who's watched us play, we've tried to play. We've had no target man, so we haven't been able to be direct in terms of playing up to a target man. We haven't scored many goals from crosses in the box, but we've just scored most of our goals in certain ways. So, of course, you want to add layers. Of course, we want to add some players that will help us achieve that. And long term, that's what it is. But, I was brought in for that very reason. I wasn't brought in to necessarily change how I do things and suddenly, play and try and achieve 70, 80% possession. The whole remit was to win games. And we'll try and find a better way to do that certainly next year. But hopefully people enjoy the commitment as well as the football.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking through your career, it's been pretty rare that you've been out of a job for very long. And, there was just over a year passed between you leaving the Millwall job and taking the Oxford job with that spell at Birmingham in between. How did you find that? What did you use that time to reflect or to learn? Or was it a case of just trying to get another job and finding it difficult? What was it like being out of the dugout, I guess, for a relatively long period of time since you started your career at Burton?
After being at Millwall for 4 years, that was my choice. It was a conversation I had with a club. It wasn't where the club come to me and said, they're going to sack you and basically want it to look like mutual consent. It wasn't that at all. It was me saying energy-wise, being away from home, it just felt like I needed a breather, really. So I actually really enjoyed that period out. I think that period of out, you're always reflecting. You're always looking at how you can improve. You're always looking at different styles of different coaches, and we all plagiarise, right? When you look at football, we'll copy to a certain extent and try and put your own flavour onto it, and you can learn in so many different ways. So it was a nice period. It also allowed me to spend a bit of time with my family. It allowed me to do some of the things I'm passionate about. I did about 5 marathons in that period of time. So. And did some incredible.
I love that you left Millwall because you needed a rest, and then you ran 5 marathons.
Yeah, mental rest was more my thought process, but yeah, no, absolutely. But I think so it allows you. Look, football management is amazing, but sometimes you're in it 24/7. There's no escape, and occasionally you want to feel normal. You want to feel like a normal person for with a family. I've got 4 children, so you want to feel normal for just a period of time, and then 9 times out of 10. You start being itching to get back in, which was sort of the Birmingham job gave me a little insight back again. And then, of course, it was looking for the right opportunity. And when Oxford came along, it just felt, I don't know, it felt like a good club with good people, with aspirations. There were limitations, I think, initially, which we've seen. But I think, staying in the division hopefully will give us a little bit of extra ambition as well. I think it's a great catchment. It's a great area to live. And like I said, sometimes some of those things are just as important as going to a big club with 30,000 fans and, having aspirations of finishing in the top 6. We can still do that, but we can just do it in a maybe more slower, sustainable way.
It's interesting because there are obvious similarities with the Millwall job and the Oxford job in terms of, Millwall may be perceived as being the kind of bigger club, but, they fairly recently come out of League One and presumably had one of the smaller budgets in the league, and yet, under your management were consistently knocking on the door of the playoffs. We've seen Cameron Brannigan yet again in the local press in the last 24 hours or so talk about Oxford, him wanting to take Oxford to the Premier League. Do you have ambition? I mean, I assume you have ambitions to manage at the highest level possible, but do you see Oxford as a club that can help you match those ambitions?
Yeah, you know what? It's funny, really. When I set out as a manager, I don't necessarily. I wanted to learn. I wanted to feel like I was learning. I wanted to enjoy my job. I never really set out with an ambition of I want to be a Premier League manager. Or I want to be X. I just felt as though I wanted to try and be the best manager I could. I turned down a Premier League opportunity because it didn't feel right at the time. So I think had I been so desperate, I would have taken that. But for me, it's about being somewhere where you feel like you can make a difference. And there's so many clubs around now where it's quite difficult to do that as a head coach. I think those opportunities are becoming less and less where, you are literally just coaching the team and that is it. I feel at Oxford, there's a nice balance between still being able to be a little bit involved in some of the recruitment stuff with Ed, still having a little idea of how we should maybe integrate some of the academy players, which is what I enjoy doing. I like sort of planning and trying to build and put all the pieces together of a jigsaw to get a team playing above their budget and above their capabilities in some ways. So this is the type of job I like. I enjoy this. And like I said, sometimes working with good people is just important as, the money, the ambition, all of those things. But I certainly do think we can be ambitious. Cammy saying we can play in the Premier League, I think is very ambitious. But I think, you should have those aspirations. How the difference for me is I have to piece together how we get there. How can we do it? How many steps does it really realistically take? And I think it will take a few. But I do think, I've showed it in Millwall. I do think very quickly you have an opportunity to maybe be a mid-table championship side and looking ahead of you a little bit more than looking behind.
It's interesting you mentioned the academy there because, this is an Oxford-specific question, but also a wider point where, Oxford have a couple of academy players at the moment who are posting some very exciting numbers, who obviously fans want to see play. But at the same time, you are, as you said, a manager whose task is to win games of football and to ensure that the points tally is as high as possible. And with a club that has a budget that probably means that, in terms of playing style and the other things, it may not be that conducive to youth development. So how hard is it to marry both the expectations of a club and a fan base to blood young players and develop young players, whilst also, achieving what is the core part of your job, which is to win games?
I think very difficult. I think there's a few factors that we need to build into this club, which is, we haven't got an under-21 team this season, so we need to do that next season to add an extra layer to that development pathway. I think that, we've had quite a big squad this season, which has made it difficult to aid that pathway. I think that, we've also, when you see some of those players every day, it's also making good decisions on when we think they're ready. Of course, I had sort of played a part in the Romain essay sort of story at Millwall. People like Damari Gray at Birmingham, people like Jude Bellingham at Birmingham, we're putting sessions on when he was a 13-year-old. He's not a bad player, is he? So what I'm saying is I've experienced, when is the right time to do it? Where is the right time to do it? I think you need to make room in the squad and you need to create some stepping stones to make it easier for them. And at the moment, we probably need to put a few more of them in place, which we're trying to do as a club. But yeah, absolutely. If there's people or players that are local players, you of course want to give them that pathway. You of course want to make sure there's an opportunity. But sometimes as well, they also have to be ready. There's a big difference between under-18s football and championship football. But we've certainly got some talented young players that hopefully will get an opportunity over the sort of next few seasons.
And looking at the jobs that you've taken in the past, obviously, Stoke was slightly different and Derby was slightly different too. But generally, it's been teams of this profile of around kind of lower budgets within the Championship, looking to overachieve, the budget itself. And something Ali and I often say on the pod is, if I was an agent, right, and I had manager clients, I would basically try and ignore these kind of jobs because it's the one job in the EFL where there's disparity between the top and the bottom end of the Championship is massive. And yet if you as a manager don't overperform your budget. So say if you've got the 22nd budget in the Championship and you finish 22nd, you're seen to be doing a bad job, which to my mind makes no sense. Do you think the way that we talk about, or the way the media basically and fans talk about managers and judge manager ability is fair, or does it need more nuance?
I think it probably needs more nuance. I mean, again, it's quite difficult sometimes, isn't it? Because we talk about style of play all the time, and I understand that, but we're also in danger of putting so much pressure on the style of play that managers play a style of play, for their own career rather than necessarily to help that club in the moment that needs that help and those fans need that help. And that's not an accusation. I think that's just where football is setting themselves up, that there's this one way of playing almost. And if you don't play with that, you are a pragmatic old school manager. And I think there's so much more nuance to that, to come into this job tactically to try and find ways to win games, is probably undervalued because people look at long throws and look at set pieces. But there's so many other facets to it. I've never minded that. I've always enjoyed these types of jobs. Sometimes you have to also be honest and see what your own skill set is and where you think you find a little bit of a niche. And to me, I've shown that this is a sort of thing that I like to do and I've had good success doing. So there's no shame in being good at that. But I do think there is a danger. I think sometimes that everyone wants to label every manager, don't they, to a certain degree. And I think that's putting a lot of pressure on young coaches now because they're now so fearful of any form of pragmatism that they want to be absolutely pure in every job they do. Otherwise, they don't think they might get the next job. And I also think that's dangerous because the job is to get the best out of your players, right? To get the best out of your players and win as many games of football as you can. And so therefore we shouldn't lose that value on the pitch, in exchange for something that looks much better but doesn't give you much flexibility. But it's a great job, isn't it? It's a great sport. There's no one way to do it. But at the same time, it's an entertainment industry, and we want to give fans a little bit of what they want to see, and I think that's also important. And we're always mindful of that.
I've got a theory that pragmatic managers are about to get very popular in the Premier League with teams who are newly promoted out of the Championship, given what's happened recently with a couple who come up playing expansive football and suddenly find out you can't really do that when you're playing against squads of worth a billion quid.
There you go.
And on that, just before we do let you go, kind of on recruitment, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how recruitment and player profiles has kind of changed, I guess, in the last decade or so, because it does feel like now, data is obviously a massive part of recruitment. It's something that I, in terms of covering teams and doing the pod and stuff like that, look at a lot. But it feels like now, it used to be an edge for some teams who are very good at recruiting with data. But now, if every single club has got a data recruitment analysis team, then how does anyone have an edge? Because unless they're all looking at the same thing. So how useful do you think, data analysis is in recruitment? And do you think that if it's being used too much, does that give an edge back to those who want to recruit in a different way?
Yeah, look, I think that, you would be foolish to not use the data. You'd be foolish to not objectively look at the numbers and see where players fit in amongst that. I think, of course, the challenge with that is it's available to everyone. It's how do you use it? And it's what do you use it for? And I think there always has to be, there has to be some element of context. Of course, the point of data is that there is no context and it is objective. So you don't make the mistakes that your naked eye or your biases might sort of force you into. I think for me, like knowing the system, knowing exactly what you want, when you haven't got the biggest budget, sometimes a player might not perfectly fit the data, but you could see the potential that their next season's data could be slightly better within your team. And I think that's how you use it. I think, some clubs are always going to be a step ahead because they have such advanced data, and the likes of Brighton and Brentford have been sort of good protagonists of that, sort of out in the open. But I also think, there's a lot of clubs trying to do it. It always comes down to the same thing. What are you using it for? What are your methods of using it? And I think there's a lot of clubs with it, but sometimes you can end up swimming in data and not see some of the good decision making. It's all about how you process and how you use it. I mean, certainly it'll be a big part of our sort of methods of finding the right players, but at the same time, watching those players, thinking about whether they fit in the system, measuring, personality, measuring decision making, measuring leadership qualities, measuring synergy of a group. I think there's all sorts of factors also. It's just one part, but it's a very, very important part. And obviously, as we all find fascinating, because there's so much objective data out there that, we can sort of swim in. So yeah.
Swimming in data sounds like my dream. But then, just in terms of player profiles, it also feels like 10 years ago, if you were a championship side who wanted to bring in a 6'3" target man, it was take your pick. Now it feels like, because maybe through Premier League academies or because players are being brought through in a different way, if you now want a 6'3" target man, then there are about 4 you've got to choose between, and everyone wants them. And that means that we're now seeing loads more clubs, not just in the Championship, but down in League One and League Two, looking abroad to leagues that it's much harder to quantify the quality of those abroad leagues and understand the kind of currency, I guess, from the goals. Say what is a goal? If a player scores 15 goals in the Finnish top division, what does that translate to in the UK? How you mentioned there's Jan Fleming, who's obviously a brilliant bit of recruitment at Millwall, who's gone on to be a big player for Burnley this season and will be a Premier League player next season. How do you find that whole, the kind of foreign recruitment idea, and how much trust can you kind of base in form that isn't in the EFL?
Yeah, I think that you've got some very simple metrics, and most clubs would weight those leagues and put some sort of weight rating on how comparable are those leagues physically. Of course, what you'd ideally do is you'd pick 4 or 5. A club like ours, where you haven't got as big a budget as some places, so therefore you can't be as extensive, you would probably pick 4 or 5 leagues and try and maximise your knowledge of those leagues. Someone like Zian was quite easy, because I was looking for that sort of technical player in Holland that maybe was a little bit out of the norm physically, so was probably a bit more physical. Same with Kieftenbelt when I brought Michael in. Just someone who's a little bit more physical, you could see straight away would probably be able to handle the physicality of the league over here. And that's the biggest thing. I mean, even from League One, where years ago you'd think League One and the Championship wouldn't be that different physically, now the gap is absolutely astronomical physically between League One and the Championship. So therefore, if a player's coming in, they have to have the capability of bridging the gap. We found that a challenge this season. That athleticism and the energy to be able to press for long periods of the game is very difficult against some of the top teams, because you just can't live with it. So I think, you have to still, that's why I'm saying yes, you have the objective data. Yes, you have leagues that you can measure and weight and see how close they are to the Championship. But I still think the naked eye still has to, you still have to make a good subjective decision on whether you can just see and feel that player in your team, and after meeting them and after sort of seeing a lot of the way that they act, you still have to make that decision, on the characteristics as well. So yeah, there's so many attributes to that. There's so many different providers depending on who you use, but yeah, I think we're doing quite a good job here, and I think that it's becoming harder to unearth someone like you say, because most clubs have a far bigger capability of unearthing those players at an earlier age. But there's still a great market in particularly in Europe, and it's one that we will be looking to maximise, definitely.
Great stuff. Thank you, Gary, for spending half an hour or so with us today. Thank you for delivering Oxford to safety, I can say. And best of luck for the summer. I hope you get a bit of a break, although not too long, because there are some gems you need to find in Europe.
Thanks for your support, George, along the way, mate. Thank you. I appreciate it.